I don't keep you here for 3 hours. So my expertise all in ornamental production, in controlled environment, agriculture, et cetera, is really in soilless production systems. And so I've been working a lot with cut flower growers in New Hampshire, but that soil-based system is, I have some personal experience with it, but it's not really my expertise. So I just want to honor and recognize the fact that there are folks here who have far more expertise than I have in terms of producing cut flowers in fields, and I would love to hear your feedback or places where you think what I'm going to present today maybe doesn't make the most sense for your farm. I'm really going to focus on scheduling, and this is sort of a scheduling that's a hybridization of greenhouse scheduling and field crops scheduling. I think it makes a lot of sense for cut flower growers. Some of you, I'm sure, are scheduling really effectively in a very different manner, but I think this is a method that works for the clients that I've been working with, cut flower clients that I've been working with. And then we want to talk about costing and pricing. And I know we could probably start a flame war here if we wanted to, talking about prices and setting prices and whatnot. But the big thing I really want us to do is to leave this with sort of one or two intelligent ways of really allocating our overhead costs, our indirect costs, because that's where, folks think, oh, I'm making money. I paid 20 cents for a seed and I'm getting $3 for a stem. Must be making a bunch of money, right? But then at the end of the year, of course, when everything gets added up. So how can we, before we sow that seed, how can we figure out what the everything added up is going to cost that stem? Does that sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, so let me take the screen.
Don't worry, Gertie. We're gonna stay with more.
And I hope that right now what you are seeing is the full screen that says cut flower planning. You're not seeing my notes screen. Okay.
That's great.
Which does make me wonder, where's my note screen? Okay, and you're still not seeing my note screen, right? Okay, even though I am seeing it, good. Oh yeah, so one thing, so I'm going to show this, some of this stuff on a grid, like with graph paper. You'll be able to do this on graph paper, but if you're not comfortable with Excel, so I'm not going to get into Excel on this presentation, but there's there's a million how to learn Excel basics on YouTube right now for free. And I just highly recommend you get comfortable with a spreadsheet program to do this math for you so that we don't have to do it out line after line after line after line. But we're going to do it out line after line after line today. We're going to pretend we're doing graph paper. All right, so first thing I want to talk about is weeks and the week, right? So I could say to you that it takes 4 weeks from when you sow the seed to when you'll have a pullable plug, and I'll put an S on the end of there, right? It'll take that many weeks. If I say you are going to do something on week 4, right? In ornamentals, we break the year up into weeks, and this is, I don't know what's funnier, that this is 4 years out of date or that this company no longer exists, right? But vendors can give us calendars that have the week numbers in here. There's 52 weeks in a year, of course. And sorry, I'm pointing to things and you're not seeing it. Now you should be able to see where I'm pointing. And so by breaking the year out into weeks, so Mother's Day is like week 20, Memorial Day, week 22, it makes it a lot easier to do that math. You could do it by day if you wanted to, break it out 365 days. If you were growing microgreens, I'd probably advise that because, this is going to be a 5-day or a 6-day crop. But weeks for what we do gives us enough leeway where, we're not that precise that we can say that this is a 65-day crop, right? So we'll break it out into weeks. And so in our scheduling, the way I want us to be thinking is in terms of the week, I want us to plan out the major life events of that crop backwards, right? So I want to start then, that means we're going to start with our target week, the week that we want to start cutting that crop, or the week that we, you know, for greenhouse folks, the week that you want to sell that pot. But for us, it's going to be the week that we want to start cutting. That's our target week. And so we talk about rolling sows and rotational sows and stuff like that. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But really, if I have this group of cosmos that I want to start cutting on week 30, and I say, well, I want to have some rolling sows, what I really want you to think of that is I want to have another crop of cosmos that I'm going to harvest on week 32, and then another crop on week 34. And I want to deal with each of those as their own distinct crop, right? So a crop is cultivar. So, one plant, one color, and then one target date, and that indicates a crop. So if I'm doing, Oklahoma series zinnia and I want to harvest it on week 24, and then I do other Oklahoma series and I want to harvest them on week 26, that's two different crops. And so by going backwards, we need to know, all right, if I wanted to harvest this on week 26, when do I need to transplant it, or when do I need to direct sow it? And so we're going to use those durations, those crop durations, in terms of weeks. And where do we find those times? So the vendors, the seed vendors, plug vendors, really want us to succeed. But this is where we see a big difference between commercial seed production and commercial seed sales versus sort of, small packets or seeds that are really marketed to the homeowner, is that seeds that are marketed for sort of backyard gardening often don't have this sort of information associated with it. We can often find it by going to a larger manufacturer, a larger seed company. And at the end of this presentation, I have a sort of a partial list of some of major seed companies and their production guides, their culture guides, right? So I have a little snippet here. These are both actually from Ball Seed, the Ball Seed production guide. And you can see they have a cut flower section. They have an annuals section, perennials, vegetables, etc. In the cut flower section, they have a group called the propagation guide. And if we look here, we see anemone, Mona Lisa series, what size plug they recommend. And then right here, plug crop weeks. That is, I blew it up here. How many weeks do we expect from when you sow that seed to when you have a pullable plug? Right? So that's one piece of data that we're going to need to use in our scheduling. We look down here and we see on a finishing guide, we'll stick with the same plant, right? Although I think I picked a different one for my next slide. But in this case, if you are growing it, that's why, because this is for greenhouse growing. This is Asclepius, for example, field grown, 8 to 12 weeks, right? And this is finishing. So this back here, how many plug weeks does it exist? Or we could say weeks from sow to transplant. And then finishing would be weeks from transplant to first harvest, right? And we could see, for some reason, I highlighted the tunnel one, and we see 8 to 12 weeks. Okay. So when we start building that schedule on a piece of graph paper or in your spreadsheet, obviously we're going to want to know what the crop is, what variety. Maybe you put one in there for color. I like this distinction between if you're buying the plug or if you're buying the seed, because remember, what we're doing here is we're going to start at the end and work our way back for the major life events. And if you're buying a plug, the first major life event for you is getting the plug, right? Which we can kind of be synonymous with transplant week. The major life event of seed going into the plug didn't happen at your place, and so we don't need to worry about it. So I like this distinction because this is going to let us know, and when you start getting really fancy with Excel, it's going to let Excel know that it doesn't need to calculate sow date if it's coming in as a plug, for example. Okay, and then we should know if we're going to direct sow or if this is something we're doing inside. And then we start with that target week, right? So this is, when do I want to start cutting that crop? And then I need to know how many weeks it takes me to get there. And that's what we get from those grower guides that we were just looking at. And then when do I have to transplant it, right? So target week is the last event in its life. except for post-harvest stuff, which I'm not going to talk about. Transplant is the one that has to happen before that. And how far apart is it? It's this far apart. Plug weeks. Can you guys see my laser pointer when I say this and point? Okay. Plug weeks, that's how long it takes. Remember, it's got the S on there. How long it takes to get to transplant from when I sow it. And sow week, that'll be the week of the year. So we can imagine, I can fill this out. Sunflower Pro Cut Orange. Let's say I'm going to do this one from seed, and I'm not going to direct sow it. So which of these am I going to have to fill in if I'm not direct sowing? It's going to be all of them, right? And I know it's kind of breaking our brain because we're looking at it backwards, but that's how the scheduling is going to work. So I'm putting these things out here in reverse chronological order because this is how we're going to build that schedule. So let's say 26 is the week that I want to cut those sunflowers, and I see it takes 6 weeks. Of course, your experience and your grower guides are going to tell you that, later ones, the same crop might be a 5-week crop. If you're doing really early in a tunnel or something, but it's not too early for it, that might be a 6.5, 7-week crop. But we'll leave it at 6. So if I want to harvest it on week 26 and I learn that it takes me 6 weeks to finish it, and I realize that you all probably what a lot of us have is sow the Pro Cut Orange seed on week 20, whatever it is, something like that. And then you have harvest records. So I suspect you all have a lot of these records already. They're just kind of in different places, right? And if we can synthesize those into a production schedule, you're going to see in a little bit, we can actually continue to build that out and use that production schedule to help us with our money too, with our costing and whatnot. All right, so clearly week 26 minus 6 weeks equals week 20. So this thing needs to be transplanted on week 20. And apparently I'm doing plugs of this one. So growing my own plugs. So if I'm transplanting on a week 20, I look it up and it takes me 4 weeks from when I sow that seed into a plug to when I can transplant it, then I know I need to sow it on week 16. Okay. Next example here, still Pro Cut Orange. Oh, but this is going to be a direct sow. Okay, so these I'm direct sowing. You know where I'm going with this. I want to target week 30. It takes me 9 weeks from a direct sow, right? So it's one total of 1 less week here. This one I was saying it's going to take me 10 weeks. Now I'm saying it only takes me 9. Probably because it's a little bit later in the year. So I'm saying transplant week, but really that means when I stick the seed in the soil, right? This is my into the soil week. And then plug weeks don't matter because I'm not growing a plug. I'm direct sowing it. If I do this campanula, I'm going to buy in a plug. So direct sow doesn't matter. It's not applicable. I want to hit week 34. I look it up, takes 13 weeks to finish. So week 21 is when I need to transplant that plug into the field, and I'm buying plugs, so these don't matter to me. Campanula Champion White plug. I want to hit week 38. Still takes 13. So clearly this is pretty straightforward. I need to get this one in 4 weeks later. Okay. So the thing when you build your schedule out this way, so now I've got this column called transplant week and this column called sow week, right? And I can now sort this. I guess this is a silly example because I only have one for sow week here. But if I've got 150 rows now, I can sort based on transplant week. And that now becomes a calendar for me, right? That's now my transplant calendar. And I can give that to my employer. I can give it to myself. I can hang it on my refrigerator. And I can be like, okay, what is it? Oh, it's week 18. Here are the 8 things that I need to transplant this week. And then I do it again for a different calendar and I call it sow week. And I hang it on my calendar and my refrigerator. I'm like, okay, it's week 12. Here are the 7 crops I need to sow this week, right? So this helps us in terms of, particularly with communication for labor, but for ourselves too. So that's time, right? We've got time, space, and money. This is time. I want to talk a little bit about space. So on-center spacing is how we refer to this stuff. So if these are whatever plants they are, if this square here is 1 inch, that's 1 inch square. These things, if I go from the center to the center, is 4 inches. So we call this 4 inches on center. And if I do it this way, it's 4 inches on center, right? We could imagine staggering it, which makes our math a lot crazier, but we can sometimes fit more stuff that way. But this is 4 inches on center, we call this OC spacing. And what I want to show us is that 4 inches on center, so from this point to this point, is still 4 inches from the midpoint to the midpoint. And that means that each plant now receives this area. And this area is 4 inches by 4 inches. And so this particular plant has 16 square inches, right? So if you take the on-center spacing and multiply it by itself, if you square it, that's going to give you the area for that plant. So if I write down 4-inch OC, we immediately know that that's each of those plants takes 16 square inches, okay? And this is why. And you can see then each plant gets its own little 16 square inches. Here's one thing that folks have tripped up on before. This big square right here is a foot. And you can see this foot is comprised of 12 inches. This little line right here is 1 inch. This big line is 1 foot. So there's 12 little inches here in a foot, which we all know, right? Now this little square is a square inch. It's 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch. The big one is a square foot, 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot. So how many square inches are in a square foot? There are 144 square inches in a square foot, right? So I've seen folks make mistakes where they think for some reason there's 12 square inches in a square foot and they get numbers really silly. So just remember that when you square it, it's like that. So we're going to build this out a little further. So if we're doing successions, I'm proposing that we think of those as new crops, a new crop row, right? So successional sowing just means it's a new crop, this same crop you've already done, but it's going to have a different target date, and then just build the math out from there. You sort it by the transplant week and add up the footage weeks in the question. For cover crops was Hannah sent me some folks that asked questions about cover crops. I think same deal. So schedule for the weeks that you want to cover. We're going to get to money in a little bit and how money works in with space and time. If you're doing a cover crop, you don't want to count that field as being production, right? You don't want to, in a little, I know this doesn't make sense yet. In a little bit, I'm going to tell you that we have to count up all the area in production. You won't count your cover crops to do that. But other than that, just you can schedule it just like this, right? And as we build out the space, which we're going to do next, you can see we can allocate space for cover crop too. You know, this row or 1/2 of that row or whatever it is. So this is where we've already done this, right? You've already seen this. And now I need to know how many I want to grow, and then how much space each one's going to take, and then how much space the whole crop is going to take, and then how much bed space it takes, right? So if I want to grow 50 of these, because I think that's what my market can bear on week 26, then, and I say each of them equals 0.56 square feet, which I think that's kind of small for sunflower, but these aren't real. Nobody do any real growing off my charts. This is just to show us how it works. Yeah, and the times too. Yeah, please don't take notes on any of these times. These times are just made up. You have to look up your own timings. And we see the total space of that this crop will take is simply 50 feet times 0.56 square feet. I'm sorry, 50 plants times 0.56 square feet per plant. Gives us that much total bed space. And if I'm running 3-foot beds, that's 7 linear feet of that bed. Okay, so now I've got my space. So now I know that this crop takes 21.1 square feet, which is useful, right? Because I know how many square feet I have or how many bed feet, depending on how you're looking at your farm. And so now what we can do too, we can use this, again, a lot more powerful if you have a computer doing it, but we can do it with our eyeball somewhat well too. We can actually look and say, okay, this crop here is in the field between this week and this week. And we can start getting sums of how much space we have, right? Because we all oversow and we all plan too much and we think our beds are going to somehow magically stretch and we just end up with too many plants. So we're able to look at this and summarize on any given week how many square feet are in production. Right? But more so, I want to use this for money. So now we got to talk about money. So costs, how are we doing on time? Oh, we're doing great on time. So costs, direct costs, these are the easy ones. These are the ones that are associated directly to the crop. Things like seed, potting soil, if you're using that. Or if you're buying a cutting, if you're buying a liner, if you need like a stake to support it, etc. Maybe you can do labor, right? Maybe you can do fertilizer. Some plants take much more feed than others. Perhaps you can make allowances for that in this. I see sometimes folks really getting hung up on this and really putting a lot of effort trying to figure out how many hours go into my zinnias versus how many hours go into my eryngium, and that's useful data when we go to actually understand our costs and allocate them to the stems. But if you are getting so hung up on that question and trying to create systems that your employees aren't following, and your employers are doing 15 minutes of paperwork to record which crops they spent what time on, I would encourage you to not worry too much about which crops are getting which labor at the beginning, and let's just call labor an indirect cost, just like your mortgage or your property tax or something like that, and we'll allocate that out over everything, over all your crops. If you can make it a direct cost, if you can account it as a direct cost, that's great. If you're pulling your hair out and losing productivity because of it, I would say don't. And maybe you will at some point. These are the tricky ones, right? So whether or not you grew that sunflower crop, you still had to pay your property tax. You still had to pay your insurance, interest, maintenance. And this question here of labor and fertilizer as well. So I realize I'm speaking very vaguely here, but where I want you to be is when you have all of the costs for the year, assign the ones you can to the crop directly, and the ones you can't, we're going to call indirects or overheads. I'm sure there's some accountant out there who's like, stop using these wrong words. These words don't mean what you think they mean. So I'm using the words very loosely. But what I want us to capture is, how can we look at all of those costs that we don't know what plant they belong to or how much of each one belongs to a plant, and still know beforehand that they're going to be covered, right? So that's where we're going with this. So decide which crops are which. I'm going to stop here for a minute and let folks interrupt me, because I feel like I just got kind of fuzzy with what I was saying, and if I can clarify, I want to. Okay, so then all the costs not directly associated with that stem, how do we decide how much insurance goes to a zinnia? How do we decide how much irrigation cost goes to that zinnia? And then is it the same as for the sweet pea, in the next bed over? How can we reasonably break that up? And this was kind of a departure for me coming out of the greenhouse industry to work with cut flower growers. I propose that we look just at space. Before I click any further into this, I was approached by some cut flower growers in Louisiana, and they were like, we really prefer the method that you proposed for greenhouses because we do have so many rolling sows. Space and time counts. So let me just talk greenhouse just for a second so you can see where I'm going with this. If in a greenhouse, let's say all of my overhead costs are whatever, $60,000, fuel, et cetera, et cetera. And I have a hibiscus that takes a square foot on the bench, and it's there for 12 weeks. And then I have for some reason, I have this silly African violet that's also there for, not that I love African violets, but for 12 weeks, I'm not sure why I would do, but I have a 12-week African violet crop that's only taking, 4 inches by 4 inches, as opposed to 12 inches by 12 inches. And they're there for the same amount of time. It's clear that the amount of overhead that goes into that African violet is less because of the size. But now if I have that huge hibiscus that's taking a foot by a foot, and it's there for 12 weeks, and now let's say I put a petunia hanger that's taking a petunia basket that's a foot by a foot, and it's only there for 6 weeks, because space and time are where these costs come in. That petunia should not be charged as much as that hibiscus because it's only there for half as long. So I'm going to show you here just based on space. If you want to look at space and time, but actually, when I'm done clicking through this slide, I have a YouTube video for greenhouse growers that talks about how to allocate space and time using square foot weeks. And I encourage you to check that out if what I'm about to show you right now looks too sloppy for you. But if what I'm about to show you right now, you're like, yeah, that's it. That's for me. I'm just square feet. Let me just allocate based on square feet. Then fantastic. Then I'm barking up the right tree. Right. So the first question is, how many square feet of cut flower production do you use? Right. And that's like in your season. You add it all up. Maybe you've got a half acre of production. Maybe you've got 2 acres of production. Put it into square feet, and that's that. That's our total production. It's easier when we don't have the time function. And then what are our indirect costs for the year? Right? So in this simplistic example, it's $52,000. And then we real simply are going to take our total indirect costs for the year, divide it by the square feet that we have in production per year, and that's going to give me some dollar value of what it costs you on your farm to give a square foot to a plant. Okay, so in any given crop, and again, these numbers aren't real. Please, you have to do these numbers yourself, but you know that. But you're going to come up with some number that tells you, hey, it actually cost me just to exist in this example that I have here, just to exist. It cost me $347 per square foot every year to grow each square foot of plant. Okay. This is the one where if you want to look at how to do space and time, we create square foot weeks. So if you find you're doing a lot of sows and you're doing some lisianthus that's taking you forever, and likewise you've got some really quick crops, and you're like, it's not fair that 1 square foot of lisianthus, I'm charging my customers as much overhead for that as I am for 1 square foot of something that's much faster, and you want to start working in the time, then check out square foot weeks. And maybe if we have time today, when I'm done, we can talk about this if folks want to. But I think if we're just using space, this is a step up for a lot of folks I work with anyway, just to start allocating those overhead costs, even just per square foot. So let's look at what that looks like, and then I'll stop again and see if folks want to talk about that. So I have this little squiggle because we've got a lot of crop information. All that scheduling information here, I've compressed down into here, right? So this is target week, production weeks, transplant week, plug weeks, sow week, etc. How many, space, whatnot. And now let's look at how many stems do I think I'm going to get out of that crop. So remember, that crop is going to be 28 square feet here, sowing 50 of them. And all right, this was a sunflower, right? So for some reason I expected to lose 10, a 20% shrink. That's pretty bad, but okay, that's what we thought here. So what does that work out to be per square foot? So how many stems am I going to get per square foot? I'm going to get to see what we don't want to do is take the 50, right? We need to be realistic, but some of these are not going to come out. Or maybe this number is even higher if you're planting something that you're expecting to get multiple stems off of, right? We take our expected stems, divide it by how many square feet that crop is taking, and that tells me how many stems am I going to get per foot. Now, how much does this whole crop cost me direct? Whatever, that's seeds and trellis or something, seeds and whatever. And so I can break that down. If I expect to get 40 stems, each stem is going to cost me 63 cents in seed costs and whatever else. Now here's where we get interesting. So the farm that I just made up, we said each square foot cost them $3.47. So if we are doing 28 square feet times $3.47 per square feet, that whole crop has $97.16 of indirect costs in it. Okay. I can break that out per stem if I like. Remember, I plan to get 40 stems. That means every stem I'm projecting, and I'm doing this before anything goes in the ground, I'm projecting that each stem costs me $243 in insurance and labor and whatnot, mortgage and everything. So now I can actually say my total cost per stem, right? It's 63 cents for the direct costs plus those overhead costs. Now this becomes a meaningful way to price. This becomes a meaningful way to look at profitability. This becomes a meaningful way to assess what crops I want to grow, etc. My next slide is going to be on profitability, and then I'm done with numbers for a little bit, I think, if I remember right. Does anyone want to interrupt at this point about allocation of indirect costs per stem? Even if you're doing, if anyone is doing this and they want to interrupt and be like, I've been doing that for years. It works great. Or if you have any questions. All right, a little bit more math. So here's all that scheduling info we already looked at. Here's all that costing info we already looked at. Right, and remember when I said a little while ago, you can like print out a calendar, or you can print a schedule from this. The whole spreadsheet when you make this is going to be long and hard to look at. And you know, some people just like, I don't even want to have to begin to parse apart what all those different columns are, right? So another advantage to learning how to do it on a computer is that you can really just kind of have like reports and just show, okay, on this tab here, really all I want to look at is profitability. On this tab here, really all I want to look at is my transplant schedule, etc., and make it far less intimidating, particularly for employees. You know, if you give an employee a 30-column spreadsheet with 150 rows, they don't want to have to decipher that. And so I made it easy by kind of smushing it all into here, right? So now we've got our total cost per stem. We calculated that on the last slide, no problem. Sale price per stem. How are we pricing this stuff, right? Let's say we're doing $4. We'll talk about pricing in a minute. So now, easy math. What's the net profit per stem? Remember now this is that, and we've already accounted in that last slide, we were using the 40 as how many we were going to sell instead of 50. So we've already worked that shrink in, because remember, we had to pay for 50, even though we're only going to get paid for 40, right? Some don't make it, you know, and so we have to pay for everything, and we don't get paid for the ones that don't make it. So that's where that shrink is, and that's already worked into here. So we can call this the net profit per stem. Is each one's costing me $3.05. We get this. If for some reason you're not taking that shrink into account, this one right here wouldn't be completely true, because you're not going to sell every single one that you plant the seed on. And then this net profit margin, this is kind of this magic number where I take the net profit per stem and I divide it by the sales price. Okay, so this is net profit divided by sales price, and it gives me this margin percentage. And 23.7 is pretty good for the line of work that we're in. If you can pull all your crops in at 23.7, probably doing okay. So now you can imagine if you, I've only done this with just one row, but if you have done this with all of your crops, you know, at Christmas time, for the next year, we can actually look down this row and see, okay, the sunflowers, I mean, I knew this in my gut. We all know what crops are making us money and which ones aren't, right? But we can actually see, okay, wow, the sunflower, I'm getting a margin, and I can make $4 a stem all day, and I've got this really strong margin. But these campanula, they're just killing me, right? They're in the ground for too long, whatever. The costs are too high, and I just can't get the price I need. I'm getting 8% margin on my campanula. You know, maybe it's time to make some difficult campanula decisions. And a really nice thing about having this in a spreadsheet is we can actually start playing with it too, right? So if you imagine all that costing info is in here, you know, if I want to, we should always get the best price we can, but we can actually look at, okay, what if I really beat up my fertilizer vendor and I can save, you know, $50 in fertilizer? How does that affect my actual margin, right? Versus, I wonder if I can, from the, you know, that one store, I bet I can get 4.25 per stem on this. What would happen if I got 4.25, and see what effect that had on the margin? What do you think? I mean, there's no like right, every scenario is different, but for the most part, most everything I've ever seen, what do you think makes you more money at the end of the day? Saving a certain percentage on your costs, or increasing your price by a certain percentage? What gives you the bigger bump to your margin? Usually it's price, right? It's price, because that's coming in at the end of the equation, right? And we even saw in this example, you know, 63 cents direct costs versus 243 in overhead costs. You know, if you can add a quarter onto here as opposed to saving a quarter here, you're going to be a lot better off. So let's talk about that. So how do we price, right? Are we pricing 5 cents less than the person down the street? Are we doing markup, right? Like folks who are coming from retail, like anybody doing garden center stuff, you might kind of be in the habit of, I get something in and I multiply it by 1.9 or 2.4 or whatever it is, and that's my sale price. And I've seen folks do that with, you know, starting off in the cut flower business. And I'm sure you've seen it too. I'm sure you've seen new competitors coming into the market where it looks like what they're doing is taking the price of the seed and, you know, trying to get a guess at how much labor they put into it, and then doubling that. And they're just undercutting everything. And, you know, at the end of the year, they're going to realize they lost money on that, right? Really hard to do simple markups on crop that we're producing and we're putting so much value into, as opposed to just retailing, flipping. For greenhouse folks, this is kind of where I suggest people start. You start that pricing process by knowing what you're going to produce, knowing what your costs are, knowing what your net margin is on it, and then targeting that net profit percent. I'm sorry, I'm using the word margin and net profit percent. I'm using those kind of interchangeably, but targeting that margin. You know, if you haven't even bought the seed yet and your margin is less than 6%, you know, unless you're Walmart, it's tough to work on those margins, you know. But to be fair, we did some benchmarking, and during the 2008 housing crisis, you know, there were greenhouses that were staying alive that were like less than 1% margin, like across the board. But that's just a razor thin line to live on. And so I encourage folks, if you're under, again, in greenhouse, so take these numbers with a grain of salt. Maybe I won't even throw out numbers. If you're below a certain margin, maybe you think about not growing that crop until you can figure out either how to get the price up or the costs down. And then if you think, okay, well, what would my price look like if I was at 20%? What would my price look like if I was at 30% margin after I accounted all these costs reasonably, right? Not just marking up the seed or marking up the plug. After I've accounted all these costs, what if I'm at 30% margin? What does that do to the price? And then you look at that price and you look, okay, is that just silly? Like, is everybody in the world selling this plant for $1 and 30% margin for me means $12? I mean, okay, well that's information right there, right? Does that mean that I'm 50%, 50 cents more than it is down the street? Is that okay? I know we all love our customer base. We love what we're growing. We love what we're doing. And for some of us, we take it really, we feel like we're offending people when we raise the price 50 cents on those customers, right? And so, of course, we want to encourage you that it's business. Everybody's prices are going up everywhere. They expect it, and one of the nice things about having these numbers here is it helps us take a little bit of that emotion out of the equation. So I suggest you start with knowing the net margin on, if I grow it for this long, in this big, in this many, and I have this kind of a shrink percentage, how many stems I actually think I'm going to get out of it. And at this price, I'm going to be at 30%. Okay. And I won't even talk about discounts and sales, but discounts and sales are murder. And we just talked about playing with those different variables, and find that often this is the one that makes the biggest difference for us. It's conceivable that we might, in order to get a bump here, maybe you're cramming those whatever dahlias in there, and maybe to get a better price, you need to give a little bit more room. Maybe you've got a problem with leaf spot, etc. And if you could just kind of get a little bit, I know we all have fantastic quality, but maybe if we can get just a little bit higher quality, right? So now that's going to change that whole equation. So now if I open things up, that obviously increases the space per plant, which is going to increase the indirect cost per plant, etc., etc. So we think this stuff through, and I know this is the wrong time for me to be telling you to think this stuff through because we're staring down the barrel of the season, but pretend next Christmas, pretend you saw this lecture again. And here's some of the culture guides. I don't know what you can't really write this down. I did give Hannah these slides, so maybe those could get emailed out to you. But yeah, my bottom line there is that really go to the commercial growers, even if some of these names make your skin crawl, and use some of the guidelines that are there, because the guidelines are more targeted to commercial growers than to hobbyists. And that is my slideshow. Did I release the, did I let go of the screen share? Okay.
Yes, we're back. And actually, while we're waiting on some questions, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm also keeping an eye on the chat, and no one's entered anything yet. And also feel free to just unmute yourself. But how do you account for labor? So you said you'll put that into indirect costs. Is that like a lump sum, or how do you recommend folks do that in a less labor intensive way?
Yeah. So I would want to parse out in terms of production of cut flowers in general, right? So I mean, if you're running 6 different things on a vegetable farm, I do think you should have your labor account for the cuts. How much am I spending on cuts? And that has to be harvest too, right? Harvest and prep and things like that. Everything to get that to the point where you can get the cha-ching for it. That all counts. I was kind of hemming and hawing about, do you really want to have your employees figuring out how much on zinnias versus dahlias, et cetera? It might be significant. There are some, well, you know better than I, there are some veg farmers who are like, yeah, I definitely need to know my tomatoes versus my pumpkins. What's the labor allocation there, of course. But if that's hanging you up, if that's causing you to not be able to do an allocation of indirect costs, just take the labor and make it like insurance for the sake of this. And so then when you figure out all your production feet, it'll get broken up.
Cool, thanks. It looks like we have some questions coming in. Let's see, someone is asking about cost to market, i.e. farmers market fee, transportation to market, and packaging. Feel free to unmute yourself if this is you. I don't know if they're asking if this is an indirect cost or how to take this into account.
No, that's me.
Oh, great.
My video's gone. I have a cold, so you don't want to look at all this. No, it's just, I love your approach. I love the analytical because I kind of fly by the seat of my pants at this point. So the analytical is great, but cost to market, where I go and how much it costs, and packaging. I don't know, just to add to, I'm pretty sure that's direct cost, but it's so far at the end, build it in up front. So yeah.
I think so. Remember too, I should have given like a disclaimer. I think this is obvious. I'm not talking about taxes, right? None of this is for filing your taxes. Probably none of this is even for any of your cost accounting, et cetera. This is just for your scheduling and your pricing. And so honestly, I mean, just like if you're accounting for it, that's really the first step. Is it in there? Do you so that you're not going to be surprised at the end of the year after you sign all your checks? Did you go into the season with a plan for profitability? And so looking at what you've got there, I would think probably farmer's market fee. I'd be inclined to like figure out, okay, what percentage of my take at the farmer's market is coming from my cuts, just in general.
Yeah.
And if I'm making 30% of what I put in my pocket every time I go, if 30% is coming from cuts, I'm going to take 30% of that farmer's market fee and throw that in as an indirect cost on my cut flowers.
Gotcha.
Packaging,
like
if
rubber
everything,
bands, craft paper. Yeah.
indirect cost it, unless like for some reason you're sticking a sleeve on your Gerbers and netting the heads or something like that. If you've got one crop that really stands out, then you're probably going to want to turn that into a direct cost on that crop.
Okay. Cheers.
Thank you.
Great. We have another question. Someone asked, does the fact that some crops are harvested over a longer time figure into the cost/profit calculations, or maybe just the calendar and field mapping?
Yeah. Yep. So certainly on your timing. And it gets a little bit harder because remember, I'm asking you to sort of predict the number of stems that are coming out of that square foot. And so it is challenging on something, if you're getting multiple cuts on a Cosmos or something like that. If you're doing it the way I showed you in this presentation, where it's just about the space and it's not about the time, then you can say, okay, this is my 60 square feet of Cosmos. It is what it is. But the hard part is then you're like, okay, how many stems do I actually get out of 60 square feet of Cosmos? And if you're a first-time grower, you're not going to get that guess right, but over time with keeping records of harvest records, you're going to be able to get a better sense of that. So the fact that you might be harvesting that same 60 square feet over 3 weeks on the method I showed you here, I don't think that's going to affect that. It just makes it harder for you to know how many you think you're going to get out of it.
Great. And then here's another question about how do you take owner's salary into consideration, into labor, or take it from the profit margin at the end?
Yeah. I feel like I need to tread lightly here. That might be, so that's a huge question, right? And so we always want to say that we want folks to be at a point where they're paying themselves, as an employee. They're paying themselves for their own labor. They're paying themselves for their own time. The idea being, if you weren't able to put that work out there, does everything fall apart, right? Does the only reason your farm exists is because you're able to be free slave labor for yourself? And so we want folks to get to the point where they're able to pay themselves. And we all love what we do, but we all want to get money, right? And so again, this isn't taxes, this isn't accounting, this is just in terms of thinking of how we're pricing and whatnot. I would love it if you were at the point where your own labor was accounted for and paid for, but I realize that's just, for so many owners, it's not reasonable, it's not feasible, and then trying to divvy it up, right? To say, okay, 40% of my time is on cut flower production, whatever, is really challenging. The truth is that you get paid out of what comes, margin, if you're sole proprietorship, what comes out at the end, what have you got left? Hopefully you're doing it right, that you got something left. But in terms of this planning, I would love to see you scheduling income for yourself into these calculations.
Wait, would someone do that like as part of the indirect costs if they were to do that, or
Yeah.
how would you recommend? Okay.
Yeah, I would recommend that as indirect. There again, unless you're doing whatever, this huge field of Cosmos and then one block of some vanilla or something like that that's just taking ridiculous amounts of time, then of course you need to account for that differently.
Great.
Any vanilla producers out there?
And let's see, we're waiting. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but if anybody has any more questions, feel free to add them to the chat or unmute.
I do see Lauren has one in there about recommended net profit margin for a starting point. Yeah, so for greenhouse production, what I tend to say for people, and I'm really hesitant to say this out loud, is I'm like, if you're below 8, maybe don't bother with those crops if you can help it. And then I would love to see, if you, just playing with this math here, if you started with a 25% net margin, what does that price look like? Does that price make your heart sink at the thought of having to ask your customers for that? Or are you like, yeah, I could ask for that. My flowers are worth that. So that's where I'd like to see somewhere around that 25, 30. But again, that's not set it and forget it. That's when you start looking at that price, that sales tag, that price, and think, can I sustain that? Is this reasonable, etc. And I think a lot of us know, if we're honest with ourselves, our crops probably can sustain a little bit more than we think they can, right? A lot of folks are, it's not everybody, but a lot of growers are very hesitant to ask what their flowers can bear in the market. Anyone want to testify? Anyone have they having real success with planning beforehand and allocating costs and whatnot? Okay.
Great. Well, it seems like no other questions are coming in. So we might be time to wrap it up, or we could give folks a couple more minutes if they have other questions. Right on schedule today, which is great.
I do I'm not just hawking my video here, but I encourage, if you get a few minutes, check out that greenhouse costing one and just look at square foot weeks and look at how can I bring time into this? And it might be that you watch 3 minutes. I think the whole video is like 18 minutes, but that section's like 3, whatever. Watch the whole thing or not. You might look at that and be like, forget that. I'm good enough with space, right? Or you might be like, oh yeah, I do like the idea of allocating more costs to long crops. I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, we can put a link to that video in the follow-up email. So next week I'll send out an email with the recording to this video, and you can put a link to that other video.
Oh, great.
And any other resources, some of the other resources that came up today.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
It was a pleasure.
For sharing
Thanks
your
for having
talk.
me.
Thank you.